she's a mountain, then you're an ocean.
Hi, everybody. This is Lori, and I am the founder and CEO of Inclusivity, which is a company devoted to kindness, justice, and sustainable living. And I'm also the author of a new book, You Can Save the World. In fact, you're the only one who can, which is full of tips on sustainability. And this is our podcast, and it's called Inclusivi-TALKS Sustainability. And it's a podcast all about creativity and sustainable living and kindness and justice. So every week we have a new guest on the podcast. And this week we are really fortunate to have Kara, who I met because I was doing some work and reached out to her, the people she works for, and ended up having many email exchanges, and just really appreciated her help and thought it would be fun to have her on the podcast. So Kara, thank you for being here.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, we are really glad to have you. So I met you because you actually work for a celebrity. We're not going to say who, but that's your job. And I wanted to ask you how you got to that job, because I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, definitely. So this probably goes all the way back to college. In college, I was a theater major. Mm-hmm. I knew I wanted to work in the realm of entertainment, just not exactly sure what. I directed, I stage managed. Once I graduated, I actually ended up moving to Florida for a year, and I worked for the Walt Disney Company there. And after about a year, I did a couple of internships. I knew if I want to work in entertainment, I need to go out to Los Angeles. So I made the move about just under 4 years ago, and got out here and started diving into the film industry. So I worked on sets a lot. I was a production assistant, production coordinator, craft services, all sorts of odd jobs that I could find. And ultimately that led me to working at a talent agency. I worked at Creative Artist Agency. It's the top talent agency in the world at the moment. And I worked there for a year and got exposed to all sorts of like high profile clients and really, really great opportunities. And while there, a job came across my desk to work for a celebrity. They needed an executive assistant. I interviewed, we really hit it off, and I've been working for them ever since.
So you have this creative background as a theater major, and how do you now view that, your use of that creativity? So what are you doing now that you feel really kind of fills that need?
Yeah. So, ultimately, my goal is to end up in a creative role within entertainment. When you get out here, you learn that it's a lot, it's that who you know. And if I came out here, I didn't have any industry connections. So I've kind of had to work my way from the ground up, which is why I've ended up at agencies and things like that. And as an assistant is really how you get that exposure to all these different folks. But while I'm doing that path to eventually lead me to a creative role, I still write. I have a lot of friends that are also in entertainment. We work on projects together, co-write web series. We have done a few podcasts ourselves, just whatever we can really find. It's definitely been challenging during this pandemic time to how do you keep that creative energy going when so much of what our work is like working in person together. So it's definitely been a challenge, a lot more internalizing and writing, I'd say, has been my main creative outlet.
What do you write? What do you enjoy writing?
I write screenplays.
Okay.
And yeah, so mostly it's like screenplays and like a web series I've worked on, but most of my ideas are very I have a notebook full of like outlines and not a book full of finished projects. It's a lot of idea and like playing with those. And I do a lot of like experimental work too. So I always like to turn things on its head and like flip it around and see what we can do.
So have you done plays?
I have, yes. I produced and directed 2 of my own works when I was in college with a student-run theater organization. That project was the first one I had a script prepared for me that I edited and played with. And then the second one, we took a lot of different works and put them together. And with my co-writer, wrote it that way. So it was a lot of taking poems or personal essays, or I used letters that were sent to people and turned that into a script. And that was a really fun project.
That's an interesting creative way to look at things. So when you were younger than college, did you have a dream to to be an actor? Did you always write? Where was that creativity when you were younger?
So, I mean, I've definitely been like a creative soul my whole life. I danced all growing up. Dancing was my first introduction to like the stage.
Mm-hmm.
But even, you know, I can remember being little, I wrote songs with my friends. I would write like little plays in my journal, put on shows, like anything that like where I could get in front of people and perform. I did that a lot. I've also done stand-up comedy. I've acted. So I've done all sorts of things, a jack of all trades, if you will.
And when do you kind of remember the very first time that you were on stage, or do you remember that first experience of real creativity?
Well, I can say that I can remember the first time being on stage. I was like, I think it was like maybe third grade or something like that. And it was like a little like Christmas play.
Right.
And I remember going up there and like, just, I think I fell in love with it then. I was just like, I loved that energy of like a crowd and things like that. Like always thought, you know, maybe I'd be scared, but like, that was like definitely my first time performing that like I have a very vivid memory of. And then I remember like, I mean, even just like being like a young kid and like playing with my imagination and like coming up with these like very thorough storylines
Right.
for me and my friends to play, and then we'd put it together and then we'd perform it for our parents and things like that. So
Wonderful. So, Kara, do you picture yourself now more behind the scenes, more with the writing, or do you imagine that you'll also get back into acting or something more in front of the camera again?
I think a lot of it'll probably be behind the scenes. What I've loved the most, especially in my adult life, is directing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really like that fuels that creative energy for me. It also allows me to be in that helper role.
Mm-hmm.
I've always enjoyed helping people and like guiding. So it's kind of like a teaching role plus being creative and like very collaborative. And like the finished product, for when I see that, like brings me the most joy, is like really having that creative control and seeing something that you work so hard on like come to fruition.
So you said something earlier that I didn't know, and I just want to confirm and learn a little bit more about it. You said that a lot of times when people go out to Hollywood, if you want to be in the business in some way, you start out working for agencies, you start out being assistants to celebrities. And is that a pretty common path?
Yeah. And I mean, of course, like no two paths are going to be the same. So many people are going to have very different journeys. But I mean, a lot of like the funnel into it is doing like I always call like working for like a big talent agency. It's kind of like graduate school if you're trying to get in, like, especially if you want to work at a studio as like an executive or any of those. And you trace them back, so many of those people started as assistants somewhere, whether it was at an agency or they were an assistant at the studio to like a VP or something like that. But yeah, assistant is a really big funnel for people. And the same, so if you're going, like there's the production side, like on set,
Yeah.
and then there's the side that's more like, you know, the suits or the producers and the people that are working in the offices at the studio. So that's, you're going to be executive assistant. If you're working on set, you're going to start as a production assistant, most likely build into a coordinator, kind of really find your niche. Maybe it's the art department, maybe, you know, maybe it's behind the camera, DP, but like you're going to start in those assistant roles. It's kind of like, there's like definitely a pay your dues type vibe in Hollywood. Like they really expect you to like come out here, you work really hard, you work long hours. It's not great money, but you just kind of like suffer through it so that you make those connections, you build that experience. It's just kind of the way it's been for a long time. So it stays that way.
And when you got out there, was there anything that was sort of the biggest surprise or the biggest thing that you didn't know before you went? Anything that you
I mean, I would say definitely like working at a talent agency. Like I never saw that in my career path. I
Mhm.
never really thought, you know, and then after talking to so many people and saying, yeah, like that's, you know, that's really the way you're going to get these jobs at studios and networks and stuff. They're looking for that agency experience on your resume. And I was like, well, you know, that's wild. I never expected that. But so that was a big surprise to me for sure. And that really, honestly, how many different roles there are within film and television. Like before moving to Hollywood, you know, you think you have an idea, you know, there's the director, there's the people that work on it, there's, you know, the people that put it together. But like, I really didn't have a full understanding of just how many different opportunities there are within this industry.
And so being a personal assistant, I think that none of us have a very good idea of what that is. We've seen it a few times in movies, right?
Yeah.
So is Is it long hours? I'm guessing you use your creativity all the time in problem solving and sort of figuring
Mhm.
out how to manage things. But I'd like to hear more about that job.
Yeah, no, yeah. I mean, it's definitely a lot of creative thinking, a lot of problem solving. You know, it can be long hours, it's going to be different for each person and whoever you're working for. And you're going to have, really great bosses, and you're going to have not so great bosses sometimes. I mean, some of those stereotypes come from places of truth at times, but it's yeah, so a lot of, like, especially in the personal assistant role, you really do become kind of part of the family.
Yeah.
So you become really close with your boss and their family. They come to you for the most important things going on in their life, like whether it's, anything from like doctor's appointments to their business. They're trusting you with like really, crucial information. So you do become this first line of defense for them as well. So it's a challenging job for sure. Like, you don't want to mess up. You're very, like, people get on edge, even the nicest of people, like when, times are stressful.
Yep.
Like, you've got to be right there. You've got to be calm, cool, and collected, even if things are like going off all haywire.
So it sounds like a job that you have as a really an important part of your skill set would be being organized and remaining calm and things like that.
Definitely. A lot of it is, it's very organized, and a lot of like taking initiative and like looking for problems before they exist. Especially people like really like high profile celebrities, that are very established in their careers. They've been doing this for so long. They're so used to having somebody basically take care of everything in their life day to day, that
Sure.
they've kind of turned off that thinking to ask you to do something, because they're just so used to somebody already knowing that it needs to be done. So you've really got to pay close attention and look for those opportunities.
What an interesting That's just an interesting way of life for both you
It
and
is.
for the celebrity that
It
you work
definitely
with.
is.
I think it's a very different world from probably your life when you were did you say you were in Florida?
Florida, yeah.
Yeah. So probably your life in Florida was quite different from your life now.
It is. And it's funny because like you definitely get exposed to, like, I mean, yeah, when you are exposed to somebody of that, like, that wealth and stature, you're just like, their problems are so different than your problems or the problems of anyone, right? And it's just like the way that like money is talked about, and the way that like it's just such a different world to get thrown into. And it's funny because I feel like I've been desensitized sometimes to like prices and money, because like somebody will like say something, and I'm like, oh, like, especially coming from an agency too, when you're seeing like these giant deals go out and
Right.
like these really high numbers, all of a sudden you're just like, oh wow, like my understanding of money is like right out the door. Like
Well, that's an interesting, it kind of segues into another piece of the conversation that I wanted to have, because our podcast is about sustainability, as you know. And I
Mhm.
think it's also about creativity and all sorts of other things, but I always like to make sure we talk a bit about sustainability. And I think economic sustainability, that sort of equity and all of that is such a big thing. And I wonder if it is trickier because when you have a lot of money, it just shifts things for you. So I wonder if that makes the conversation harder.
I think it becomes more, yeah, not maybe harder, more interesting, because once you are, I think, living at that level, because all of a sudden a lot of people too, a lot of celebrities go from one day being an average person to then the
Right.
next day having this like surplus of wealth, and then everything changes all of a sudden. Like, you don't see money the same way. People don't talk to you about money the same way. Um, and so I think it takes a lot of self-awareness and a lot of effort to really try to maintain kind of that sustainability and that economic balance, and really want to be a part of that kind of solution.
Yeah, I think that that's true. So, talking about sustainability for you, what would you say is when you think that word? What does it mean to you?
When I think sustainability, I think, definitely our planet, and how can we make it last longer? How are we taking care of it? How are we protecting ourselves and future generations, and all of the energy that we have? Like, how can we use it more efficiently? So that's what first comes to my mind, is definitely our planet and the world. And that goes, yeah, down to like, yeah, of course, like economics and stuff, and these big wealth divides. Like, how do we create a more sustainable way of living for people of all economic and social backgrounds and things like that?
Yeah. And I think what's really exciting, Kara, is that I think people are starting to really think about that and really talk about that piece of it. Because I think it's not enough to say we're going to take steps to protect the environment. That's incredibly important, but it's not enough, because if we keep
Yeah.
having this continued and increasing disparity between wealth and poverty, and between, even the air in wealthy areas tends to be better than the air
Yeah.
in impoverished areas. The food supply is better, the water is better. So I think that all of those things become this big package. And the good thing from my perspective, and I'll ask you if you agree, but my perspective is we can do something about this. We actually
Yeah.
have power. We don't have a lot of time, but we have enough time. Scientists are saying we have until about 2050 to really turn this around. And
Yeah.
so that gives us a little bit of time. We need to start today, though, because that's not very far from now.
Right. No, it's super soon. Yeah. And I mean, we can just look at what's happened in the last week with these snowstorms and like what's going on in Texas. And I mean, you can really see the climate change is just right there in our faces, but definitely that economic divide of those who are really suffering without having power and energy, and those who are getting help. Like, I mean, we look at some people were able to hop on a plane and leave.
Yeah.
That's not an option for most people. So yeah, it's really, really important to try to make those changes. And we really hope that moments like this will be a wake-up call for the people that have not been as convinced that this is a big problem, because it is. And I think that there's so many like naysayers out there that have, convinced such a large chunk of the public to like kind of put like it's important but not really, that how do we like change that narrative to make it something that people want to be a part of and are like, like it's exciting, it's we can do this, instead of it being have this negative stigma around it.
I love that you said that, because really our focus right now is on exactly that we're really working on getting people to make small changes in their own lives. But the reason we're doing that is not because I believe that if I stop throwing away containers, that changes everything and the world is saved. But what I do believe is if I start doing that, then I start thinking about it more. I start feeling more strongly about it. I start going to marches. I start contacting companies that I like, and encouraging them to do better, because it becomes my problem. And I think that if all of us think of this as something we can fix, then we will fix it. But
Exactly.
I think
Yeah.
it takes all of us believing that we can and that it's important. And there are so many little tiny things we can do to make a difference. And I think that's just crucial.
Right. And it's definitely it's a human issue. It's not a political issue. Like, and how we need to shift that narrative as well to just like we're doing that. Yeah, you do it for yourself, you do it for everyone around you. But like we have that ability and like to make this change. But yeah, like you said, we've got to start now. The time is now.
So for you, when you look at your life, what's one thing that you say, yeah, I do this because it's better for the environment, or it's better for the people around me? What's just one thing that you regularly do that just for that?
Yeah, I would say one of my biggest things is thinking about like fuel and like my cars, and like having when we have to go somewhere, are we like carpooling, or are we making the most efficient use of that, getting cars that have higher, prioritizing a higher gas mileage car over a luxury vehicle, like, because at the end of the day, like that's a big, that's what's more important. Like, I don't need a fast car. That doesn't really do me any good. Like, I need a car that's going to get me to where I need to go, and it's going to make the, be as fuel efficient as possible.
Yep. Well, that is a wonderful thing. Thank you for doing that. I wanted to also ask you about so do you have like a timeline? So I'm switching gears completely, but do you have sort of a timeline as far as what your plans are?
Just like in general? And
Yeah,
like
just in
in
general,
life?
if you're feeling like you want to get more into directing and writing and want to keep doing that, is that something that's a gradual thing that you work on, as a sideline until something happens, or how does that work for you?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll be honest that it can be very difficult, especially in times like these, when these assistant roles can be very, demanding, very draining at times. And burnout's like it's really easy to fall into. So it's very important, just like it's important, like when it comes to sustainability, your own creativity, is to make time for that.
Yeah.
And it might even feel like a chore at first, but you'll realize that like once you're doing it again, like your well-being is just, your mental health is like so much better. So it's really trying to make sure you carve out that time to do that. And as of lately, I have decided that I'm going to definitely shift more into pushing into what I want my career to be. I've enjoyed the assistant roles. They've helped me build a network, but it's definitely time for me to really start to refocus on myself and what I want to do with my career, to start living for me a little bit. And even if that doesn't necessarily look like what I always thought it would be, like maybe it's not, the director of a feature film, maybe it's something smaller scale, maybe it's going back to theater, but prioritizing that over this path, because it's so easy too, once you get into this world of film and television, to like kind of have like, you want to climb the corporate ladder, like all of a sudden now I'm in this type of, well, I want to get to the top, and I was like, well, that's never really what I wanted to do. Why is that what I want to do now? So remember, like, you always have to stay true to who you are. Why always come back to like, why did I start this journey to begin with? Why was this important? And if you can always keep those goals close, you'll be fine and you'll succeed. But it's very easy to get distracted along the way.
I love that. One of the questions I was going to ask you in a little while is, what advice would you have for other people who are interested in sort of this path? And you literally just gave that.
Yeah.
That was really beautiful. So stay true to yourself and try to keep your goals in mind as you're moving forward. So for you, Kara, is there a topic that you're most likely to write about, or do you kind of write about a whole host of different things? How do you decide what to write about?
A lot of mine are female-focused stories, women's stories, and social issues. I definitely want to help give voice to marginalized groups. That's really important to me, to tell the stories that we haven't seen as much, because film and television and the media in general has a huge responsibility that we don't always think about, because so much of what we see on screen affects how we live our lives, how we view things. Gina Davis has a really great gender study institute where they do a lot of this work, especially in children's programming. When I was little, like, you think back to like what characters were, what were the female characters doing on screen when you were little? And for the most of, they're the mothers in the TV shows, they're your teachers, they're and so these are what we're teaching our kids, that these are what the options are for women. So imagine, all that you see them as doctors, and like, that's not abnormal, or astronauts, and all of these different, especially roles in STEM. Like, we don't see a lot of female characters in STEM. And there's a really interesting study. It's the what's the X-Files girl? What's the main character?
Gillian Anderson.
Yeah, but what's her character on the show?
Oh, Scully? No, Scully's
Scully.
the guy.
Yeah, Scully.
Oh,
it's Scully.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's the Scully effect. They did a study where they interviewed a bunch of women that work in STEM now, and asked them, why did you get into this? What inspired you to do this? And it was like, I can't remember the exact percentage, but it was somewhere well over like 70% of those said because they watched X-Files and they saw Scully succeed in a role like that. So that just shows you how powerful these moments can be. Or the increase of archery for little girls, like all of a sudden that like people signing up for archery classes like increased by a crazy percentage after the Hunger Games came out. Because now we saw, and Brave and Hunger Games came out around the same time, and all of a sudden girls saw that, oh, that looks great, that would be so fun, as opposed to like, that's something that they only saw boys do. Yeah. And really can do that, and then break down all sorts of like the gender barriers and all of these social norms, and really have a positive effect on the world.
This is so important. Just an interesting sort of similar situation that I can't believe I talked to my daughter last night, who is a graduate student and also teaches in college at the University of Washington. And she is supposed to be teaching a class on bias and prejudice. And she taught the class previously, and one of the TAs was a woman of color. And students literally said to her, I didn't think I could go into academics until this class, like until I saw this person. And she's now basically taken the stand that if they don't have a person of color involved in this class, she doesn't think it should be taught. She only thinks it should be taught when there's representation, because she said, I was blown away by the incredible impact that had, and how we need to be paying attention to that. Like that has to be. And I think you're talking about television and film where everyone is watching. And if there are no role models for you, how can you see yourself there? Yeah.
And it's so, I was, because I was talking to a friend, I think it's the movie on Netflix that came out this year with Issa Rae and Camille. I think it's called like Lovebirds or something like that, but it's a rom-com with the two of them. It's kind of like a action rom-com.
Sure.
But my friend was talking about it, and she was like, I was just so excited to see that, because with Issa Rae being in that role, she was just a woman in a rom-com. And like, she was like, up until now, like, I mean, she's in her 30s now. Up until then, she hadn't really seen just like a rom-com made for general audiences,
right,
that starred a woman of color as the lead, and not making it be about her being a woman of color,
right,
just a woman of color in that role.
Right.
And like, being able to see yourself reflected on screen is much more powerful than I think that we realized it was, especially when you are a person that does see themselves reflected on screen all the time. Like, you don't even think about
Yep.
what's missing.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. I'm glad we had this conversation, because when I was talking to my daughter last night, we came to that same conclusion, but it's wonderful to hear it repeated so that I can say to her, you know what? Yeah, this is the right decision. This is a good thing to do. And kind of hold your guns. And it sounds like that's what you want to do with your writing, is really respect that and find ways to create things that show that how incredibly diverse we are and how incredibly wonderful that is.
Right. And the world that we see on screen should reflect the world that we walk around in. Even from just the extras in the background, that should be a diverse crowd that we're seeing. There should be people with disabilities. There should be people, all different sorts of people of color and gender identities, because that's what the world actually looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need to reinforce that on screen and really make an effort, and not just on screen, behind the scenes as well.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we need to have more female directors. We need to have more directors of color, because their perspective is really important. And we haven't seen that up until now. Like, we see a lot of movies with female-centric characters, but we're seeing it through the male lens because it was written by a man and it was directed by a man. And then what happens when you put a woman in that role? You see a totally different version of those stories.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. Do you find that, have you found that there's any pushback to that? Do you think there's a wave to encourage that? Do you think there's still barriers? What do you feel, kind of being out there in the midst of it?
I mean, there's definitely still barriers, and there's still a lot to go. I'm hopeful that my generation and the ones like just above me and below me are making so many, as they start to rise to those executive positions and those positions of power, that we are going to see real change. I mean, you just look at things like the Me Too movement and how much that really has affected, and people having those voices to stand out. And that social media has been actually social media is a double-edged sword, but it does have that opportunity to give voice to people that might not normally have it and share those types of stories.
Absolutely. Part of the reason I asked is that when I've talked with people about doing commercials, my company is called Inclusivity. I've always pictured the commercials having the biggest diverse swath of people that you could imagine. And I have gotten some pushback, people saying, well, no, you can really only have one representation.
No.
Like, you can't have a person who has disabilities who is also a person of color. Like, that's just too much for people. And my response was, well, no.
No, it's not.
That's ridiculous. And if I lose customers because of that, then I lose customers because of that.
Right.
That's not the important part. But it's an interesting thing that I've even heard that from people that I know support the idea of this, right?
Yeah.
But just said, of course you should have diversity, but don't go too far. And I don't think we can go too far.
You can't go too far, no. And they're uncomfortable situations. And right now, diversity and is more of like a good stamp of approval than it is something that some people care about, especially when we look at those really high positions. They're trying to be more diverse, but not because they're trying to diversify. It's because they're trying to, hit that quota. One of my very close friends and mentors, Maysoon Zayed, she's a Muslim woman. She has cerebral palsy. So she talks about how she's like the trifecta of, minorities, right? She's got a disability, she's a woman of color, and she's Muslim. So like, she's like, and that, because she wants to perform on camera, and that's, that causes issues sometimes. And she stands her ground too, like, especially when working on a show that she's trying to build, like the people working behind the camera, she's like, the amount of people that in this world have disabilities, that should be reflected on my crew as well, because it's often very hard for people with disabilities to get into those roles, especially when the funnel in, right, is those assistant roles and those production assistant roles that can be like really physically trying or really mentally trying, that we've got to pave way and make room for that. And there's so much of like, well, if you can't cut it, you can't, like, we've got to do away with that whole idea. The pay your dues thing is, you learn it, that's good, that's great, but we also can't take advantage of these people and not allow people opportunities.
We need to have other paths. So I did not say this to you when we started, Kara, but we're really trying to keep these to about half an hour, and we're there. So what I'm doing with people is after half an hour, we're saying this is the end of episode 1, and we're turning this off, and we'll restart and do episode 2 to get to talk about the rest of the things. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, totally.
Okay. All right. So everybody, this is Lori. This is part 1 of our interview with Kara. Can you remind me of your last name, Kara?
Yeah, it's Ward-Tobin.
All right. So Kara Ward-Tobin will be back for episode 2, actually right away, but it'll be a minute. You'll have to turn it back on. We'll be right back.
If she's a mountain